In this series we'll talking a lot about the kind of fundamentals of evolution. So what is evolution? What are mutations? What is the role of chance in evolution? We're going to change direction and become much more personal and think only about evolution in the context of ourselves, and in particular the question that I want to ask, and I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, I'm not going to answer it. The question I'm going to ask is, why are we alone on the planet? Why are we the only species of human? Before digging deep into the question, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It will immensely help. Your feedback is very valuable to me. Please leave a comment, I read all of it. You also can check other interesting videos and series already uploaded. Also press the bell icon so get the notification of new video. If you think about that, it's sort of very glancing moment. You might think that's a completely trivial question, but it's not that trivial for those of you who you are known perhaps fans of science fiction. There are lots of great science fiction movies where your hero goes into a bar and there are all these different species at the bar, all chatting away in multiple languages and ordering drinks, and actually if you look around the world there are lots of instances. If we look around, we are all human, no one sort of interloping from a different species here, and it's not though inconceivable to have a sort of parallel planet in which we were a mixed species, right? We could be giving this talk in multiple languages to multiple different species, all bipedal, relatively intelligent ape-like organisms, and interacting together, but we don't live like that, so there is something that has happened to make humans the only human species on the planet. We don't know the answer to why, but what I want to do is think a little bit about how we got here and maybe speculate a bit about the factors that might have driven that evolution, and perhaps even going forwards think a little bit about where we might go from here. So, before we think about it, why are we the only species? It's quite important to think about what a species is anyway, and that's not actually a very straightforward question to answer. There are several definitions of what a species is out there, but perhaps the one that is most widely used and most kind of functional is the one proposed by Meyer, which is known as the biological species concept, which in essence says that a species is a group of individuals that reproduce successfully together. It's important to say successfully, so this is not just about an ability to reproduce, but an ability to do so in a way that maintains the species. So, if most of your offspring die, then actually that's not a successful reproduction. You must be able to reproduce successfully, and that group is reproductively isolated from other such groups, so in other words, you're not breeding with other species. You are distinct entities. That actually is quite a tricky thing to define and quite problematic, particularly in the case of humans. It's probably still the best example or the best definition we have of a species, and by that definition then Homo sapiens, our own species, is indeed both of those things. We can all reproduce together, and there aren't other species with which we reproduce. Raises an interesting question, and the question essentially is not why we're only one species, but why don't we have another sibling species that looks a lot like us on the planet because of lots and lots of animals and plants. For example, if you're a lepidopterist, if you're keen on butterflies, you'll be familiar with Heliconia's butterflies, and they're a complete nightmare because they all look the same, but there are actually many different species. There are lots of sister species in this genus, and the same holds true for lots of other animals. The marsh tit and the willow tit, and you've got to be a pretty advanced ornithologist to be able to spot the difference between those two species in the field. So, there are lots and lots of examples of species that are very similar, living relatively close to each other, and yet we don't go down the road and pop into the supermarket and see something that looks like a bipedal hairless intelligent ape but isn't actually a human. We are, as far as we know, alone, or are we? The first question perhaps is, might we have missed something? And one of the things that people occasionally speculate about in the press is maybe we have missed another related species of human, and actually that's not completely impossible to think about, because even today in the 21st century, in this very developed kind of world in which we live, there are large areas of essentially unexplored wilderness. So in fact, in this estimate from 2018, almost a quarter of the world's land surface is still classed as wilderness. It has relatively little human habitation or human activity shown here. So, it's perhaps possible that you have some other species living in these wilderness areas, although of course even wilderness areas are visited relatively frequently by tourists or explorers or mountaineers. It seems a bit unlikely that you'd have large populations of another human living in those locations. There are some parts of the world, of course, that are completely unexplored, and by recent estimates it's about 2 or 3% of the world's land surface has genuinely not had humans access it. There, of course, you may have some other species hiding out. The problem is that 2 or 3% of unexplored world are largely things like remote mountaintops, the middle of Antarctica, places that are not compatible with human life, or at least human life as we know it. It's possible, of course, that there's some species that can live in the middle of Antarctica and is happily roaming around there and we don't know about them. They would look quite different to modern humans. It's fairly unlikely that they exist. There probably isn't a second species of human that we haven't discovered yet. What about the second possibility? Maybe there is a second species lurking right under our noses, and actually if you were an alien zoomed down onto this planet and you looked at the fantastic diversity of humans on it, you might reasonably think this is not one species. We come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and colors and cultures and societies and family structures, and we do all sorts of different things. If you were looking at it in another species, you might reasonably think represented different groups of people. This, of course, was something that early explorers, European explorers in particular, floated as ideas, and in fact even quite late into our kind of exploration of the world. People were speculating on this. So this, for example, is a picture of Charles Darwin arriving in South America on his voyage on the Beagle, and when he arrived there, in his diary, he noted many interesting interactions, one with the native population of Tierra del Fuego. In his diary at the time, he noted this. He said, "Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world." This was obviously relatively late, this as well into the 1800s. Prior to that, European explorers had met native indigenous populations in many countries and had repeatedly come up with this suggestion that maybe these were distinct. This, of course, this pseudo-scientific idea was the horrendous justification used for real tragedies like enslavement of people in Africa and the eradication of Native American populations in a deliberate genocide by Europeans. The point about all this, though, is completely untrue, we know. And we knew actually from the very beginning, the very first interactions of Europeans with native populations elsewhere, that we are one species either through coercive or sometimes consensual relations. We knew that people could have perfectly successful children together, and actually one of the great revelations of our whole genome sequencing today is that many of us perhaps realize that we have a very interesting blend of genetics from all sorts of populations in the past. Because as we now know, all humans all around the world are one species and able to reproduce together. So, we're not overlooking some secret second species within our own group. Neither do we have a hidden species somewhere else, nor are we overlooking something here. There is a third possibility, and the third possibility is maybe we're overlooking a sister species that we talk about all the time. So we are, as you well know, hopefully great apes, and along with the other families of species with the great apes, we all share many characteristics, and our closest relations, as I'm sure you know, are the chimpanzees and bonobos. So perhaps I'm saying we're alone as a species, and I'm talking nonsense, because maybe these are our sister species, and that's a possibility. They look a little bit different to us. They're much hairier for starters, but actually they're very, very similar, and in fact by genetic data we know that we share something like 98% of our genome with chimpanzees. That's pretty high, and so perhaps chimpanzees are actually a sister species to humanity. However, if you look at that level of genetic sort of preservation within humans, the amount is much, much more consistent. This human-to-human comparison shows 99.9% DNA identity, and even the most diverse humans still share something like 99.6%. The differences between any two humans in terms of genetics are an order of magnitude smaller than the differences between ourselves and chimpanzees. Perhaps more importantly, chimpanzees of course have a sister species, bonobos. If you look at those, the genetic distance between them is about 4%. In other words, the difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo is about the same as the difference between a human and a quite different human from the same species. These two are indeed sibling species, but they are not a direct sibling species to human. The distance is much higher, so doesn't matter which way you look at it, it's whichever way we bore this question. It does indeed appear that we are on our own. I am hoping I am successful to explain about the question which we are talking about. We will continue to talk about it in our next video. Till then, take care, and please leave a comment what are your thoughts about it. Please subscribe to my channel you haven't yet. Thanks for watching.